Okay, so the format. Oh, thank you, John. That's really nice. I appreciate that. It's great for presumably for you, but certainly for me to have a good amount of people on live, a quorum, so to speak, a sufficient number of people. Me and the naked butt is here today with that Facebook ad, but it doesn't scroll down. It's the final one. I have slide. Okay, so with this series, I'm going to be looking to really cap off law of implication, and it's not like a sub series. I'm going to be focused on really helping you to understand and integrate the law of implication itself. I don't know if it's the basics, but basic or not, the law of implication as opposed to looking at kind of subtopics and applying my thinking to them. I'm going to be, again, directly attacking that. I think people will welcome that. And I'll probably be looking to play more of an advisory role to OMG next year. As I've been saying, this may be my kind of a capstone as well series to where I really am looking to is I like do really good justice to law of implication and have you really take away something that's integrated and understood and so forth. And furthermore, in terms of the format, a little bit like what I said in the last series with a twist maybe. So we can imagine that we're together in a semicircle or whatever live and a little bit informal that way. But we can also imagine that I have a whiteboard and prepared things for that where and this is, I've always done this, but where I'll do talking for 45 minutes to an hour ish. And I'm like, who knows what that'll actually turn out to be if I get on a roll, but roughly in that. And then do some discussion as well. And then have the whole thing be an hour and a half, 2 hours, something like that. So that's about what I'm looking at for this series. I do think that it will be very worthwhile, very impactful. And I continue to just see wherever I look that there's really nowhere else that you're going to be getting what I know in the way that I know it. There's certainly things that, parts, things that I'll say that you'll read somewhere else or that you'll come across, but there's a lot that you won't, and the totality of it, you won't. As usual, I don't have anything to sell you. There's no real thing that I'm not trying to get you to follow me or whatever, but just in terms of communicating with you and helping you to understand this. And that's my best understanding. I think that's relevant as part of hearing and understanding what I'm saying is for me to say that. Hey, David, been a while since November 2013 OMG Live, first LOI experience. Exactly. That's kind of, I was saying to Mike, like I first had the Law of Implication series in 2013. Well, I think I actually recorded that and then at some point did live webinars later on to support it. But yeah, this is a capstone to that in a sense, or the closing of the book in one sense, but I'm not going to disappear or anything. And of course, I'll be looking to take this more wide in various ways. And also my way of showing appreciation to you guys for being active members of OMG for carrying that LOI as well. But this is just for members, this series. So looking to cap it off for you guys in a particularly effective way. Chapter 5. Oh, excellent. Yeah, the LOI 2013 series. Stephen was telling me just today, an hour ago on the phone, Mike, that he thought you just knocked out of the park incredibly with that book. Just yet another person that's saying that. So wonderful to hear. Congratulations. Of course, check out Mike's book if you haven't. People are reading through it pretty quickly, but it's substantial, not too long and not too short, around 100 pages. Janine says, I was thinking earlier that what fireworks do to my eyes is listening to it, David, to my brain. I appreciate that, Janine. Dave says a lot of implications, not what you think, it's how you think. Yeah. Yeah. One of the takeaways that I'll put on the first slide will relate somewhat to that. You chose wisely. Happy to be here wisely for skipping the networking event and coming here. Happy to have you here, Michael. Great. Yeah. And you agree, and Michelle, right, that there's nothing like this. I don't pride myself on that. I'm lazy enough that I'd be perfectly happy to have someone take over, but it's just not the case, right? So you definitely want to get this. This will be recorded for future members. So part of me saying that, I know a lot of you guys feel that, or at least you feel the importance of being on here since you're here. But for posterity, I wanted to say that. And I'll be the first to happily announce it. That's no longer the case. Matt says, if no one else has figured out the question, how do I know what's true? Then it must be the case that everything else you figured out is unique, since every question leads to that. Yeah, that's one of the craziest things is that I'll come across a lot of great stuff. I even have another book that I referred to in the past, but I'll mention again at some point on this webinar or soon in this series. That's excellent. But yeah, it's just, there's a way that people don't come to the full conclusion, which is really then ends up being nowhere close, right? You can't really be close and not really get to the importance of the answer with epistemology and how to know what's true and so forth. I'll be using the word clarity a lot instead of understanding. And one of the things I'll be emphasizing are the kind of wrong forks in the road, like the ways to misinterpret the core ideas, what we're talking about here, and the core application, and to really make sure that we don't run into that. Okay, let's bring up my slides here. So I put here takeaways, and this may be some of this, some or all that I'll touch on today, but then also as the series progresses, I really have no idea as I'm starting out what the progression will be like webinar by webinar. I don't have it planned out webinar by webinar. I have it more planned out by understanding and number of notes. And I just want to continue until we really get the core concepts. Okay. And including really that what that's going to mean in a lot of cases is distinguishing like things like clarity and understanding from the easy ways to think that you're going for clarity, but you're taking a wrong turn, right? So I want to make sure about that. All right. So I wrote here on this slide that one of the things we can expect, and I might add to the takeaways as we go on in weeks, but for now I can say that I really want to make sure that I'm clear about the importance of clarity about some things that I mentioned here about these words aren't going to bring to mind the full meaning, right? They're just kind of notations that later on you'll look to see that you want to have a real clear distinction about them and what they mean. So source versus method is extraordinarily important, and it's something that has got to be waylaying everybody, right? It's such a core and hit assumption. It's so integral to how people think and experience the world and understand the world and go about their day by day decisions, but in a big way and in a small way. There's a way that people are looking for a source of regarding knowledge, regarding happiness, regarding succeeding in particular areas. And it is not necessarily crippling in the following way. Whenever, basically, whenever, if I want to bake a tasty chocolate cake, then it may be that there is a source that I'm going to look at. And by the time I interpret it and apply it, I'm going to end up baking a tasty chocolate cake in the way that I was hoping. So whenever the source fits inside the environment and assumptions, the various frames between our own mind and how the environment is, how my taste buds are, right, and so forth. With the chocolate cake analogy, the same recipe that might taste good to certain American taste buds or a subset of Americans might not taste as good to Koreans, perhaps, who knows, right? Or it may, right, but it may not. So if we essentially get lucky, and if there's very close, effective overlap between a source and then, as I said, the assumptions in our mind, our environment, and such, and whatever outer frames and boxes there are, then the source will work, right? And the more the overlap is, and I'm saying like if we don't really understand what all those frames are that happen to be aligning, right, in our mind and the environment and so forth, but if they just happen to align, and to the extent that they align, then a source will be effective. But overall, there's a way that people don't think of it this way. They don't go out and say, "Oh, I want to use a source. I want to find a source rather than a method." One of the ways this shows up that pretty poignantly is ultimately we often want ourselves to be a source, including the whole confidence circular trap, where in terms of making sales or just being attractive or getting yourself to take action, we want to feel confident, but that confidence ends up being twisted where it's confidence in ourselves as a source instead of in a method that we follow that is going to work. And if that method ends up just being a recipe, now we're back to a source. It's easy to just rename something that really is just a source. It's really just something where we're hoping that all kinds of hidden frames and assumptions and environmental factors line up, right? Just calling something a method when in fact, what I mean by a source is when we don't really have understanding of a whole bunch of potentially relevant frames and such factors and so forth. And this relates to how what our mind does. And what we're going to want to do is both understand this and we're going to want to embrace and harness this, not just decide that we're a source that doesn't do this, but play this will be somewhat repetitive, but a new take and a new on all of it. And I'm tying it all together in one series. So if you recognize some things I say, that's normal. But our mind as an integral part of what it does for us, or we can think for us or just what it does, period. That's part of what we have to harness in life is that it looks to take things that are gray and also staticky in terms of if you picture like a TV that has some static and make the picture clear. But it does this in a way that I mentioned sometime fairly recently, a little bit like the way keyframes work on video files. Where there's the way encoders work is they're only vaguely aware of this, but I think it's sufficient for my metaphor here, is that there's a keyframe where kind of something like every pixel of the frame will be in the video file, like the MP4 or whatever file, maybe every 5 seconds or so. But then the rest of it is guessed at and filled in by an algorithm that's part of the codec or the video, and it's not actually encoded for. Like all the pixels of every split-second potential frame are not all stored. Otherwise, the video file would be many times larger, right? Many whatever, gigabytes or terabytes or whatever it would end up being. And it was fascinating to me when I heard that. I didn't know that's exactly how it worked. Logically, it has to be something like that, right? So it clicked when I heard that. But that's a good mental picture for a lot of what our brain does. And it's not that it's good or bad, but it's very bad to not work with that and supplement that. So our brain is constantly turning what would be gray and what it doesn't know and then what we don't know into something that feels black or white. Now, it doesn't always do that. We don't feel confident about everything, of course, but it gives us confidence and even like visually gives us a sense of crispness and clarity that is more than what's really hitting the retina. And then the same thing happens conceptually. That's another part of what I mean by, in that case, a source. What ends up happening is as part of turning gray concepts or even visual experiences into black and white, so to speak. Of course, it's color when it's visual, but something that's more crisp and clear, but it's in a fabricated way, a fabrication that often works, but it's still fabricated. But then when it doesn't work, when it makes us feel certain of various assumptions or just makes them, it also just makes, as it does this, it makes a lot of things invisible, right? And then it wants to reinforce that black and white. We generally have, it's common knowledge that there's a sense of bias and so forth. But what's not at all common knowledge and common practice is how to work with this, right? What people commonly do is want to have confidence in themselves, which ends up being what I'm talking about being a source. And that confidence ends up wanting confidence in that something that's gray really is black and white, such as that you're a good salesman. And you might say, well, should I think I'm not a good salesman? No, what we want to do is have a different way of looking at it, where our confidence is in an overall approach to the world that involves a correct understanding of constantly gaining more clarity from everything we do, everything we experience, all our feedback, our actions, our results, feedback, our thoughts. All of it can be part of an overall method of, you don't have to, it's not even gaining clarity, but that's a simplistic way of putting it. That's fine for now. I might tweak that a little bit in the future, but for now, basically gaining clarity or achieving clarity, because that the achieving is going to go into what's coming up next. And I'm giving a little bit of an overview here. And then as I continue with slides, I'll continue to fill in what I mean, but I'm more just giving an indication of the type of thing I'm talking about by these words. And then we'll gain more and more clarity as we continue from different angles and different things that I say that are related. But overall, by method, I'm talking about a method of achieving more and more clarity. And that can be where your confidence flows from. And so confidence in you as a source is related to, or other sources, is in confidence that they're already correct, already clear. Instead, you can shift your confidence towards becoming or achieving clarity or pieces of clarity, right? When it comes to sales, you can have confidence in distinctions that you have accumulated as you accumulate them. Questions to ask, things to look for, methodologies, all of which, and actions, things to say, but all of which serve clarity. Clarity, which is in essence a synonym, but it's an attempt at me being more clear or having a new word that I can then fill in specifically when I've been talking about understanding before. Right? There was a point where something clicked for me that was near the beginning of all of this, of me figuring all this out, which was a glimpse, not a total understanding, but a glimpse at how if I just measured progress by by gaining understanding, then that would always be the answer of what could organize my actions and thoughts. And I would have the best results by doing that. And what I just said isn't necessarily phrased perfectly. I'm going to be talking about a misuse of wanting progress in a moment, actually. But still, there's a glimpse of a truth there that's all important and that's never changed. And now, for example, if you were to visit a foreign land and let's say you went to a place and it was particularly cold, people weren't all rushing around everywhere, then you might not have full knowledge of that new place, and there might be drawbacks of it and so forth, but that glimpse might change you in a fundamental way, right? Because it's a distinction of something new. But notice that my point here is that you can have a glimpse that's relevant and that causes you to pursue an understanding of what it might be like to say be more peaceful, right? This might exist even today, right? If you go to somewhere like Thailand, overall there might be drawbacks and disadvantages to Thailand or wherever, or to a particular city there, or a mountain retreat there, or whatever. But you might get a glimpse of something that might lead to opening you up to a whole new avenue of exploration that might be very productive. As a source, it might be flawed in all sorts of ways, right? Just simply moving there might end up with all kinds of potential drawbacks. I'm not saying it is or isn't, but that's certainly plausible, even probable. But that glimpse can be very powerful and real. And that glimpse is something that you can say that you don't know all about that mountain retreat in Thailand, in my hypothetical example, right? Or a city that you visit that gives you a glimpse of something new culturally, whatever it might be. The glimpse, the distinction, the start, like a beginning or something different, right? You only need a few data points to see that something's different. Those few data points are not the totality of the city or the mountain retreat or the whole concept of an aspect of peacefulness that you might have in your life. So there's a difference between a distinction and full understanding. And the reason I harp on that for a bit is that people missed out on the power of real knowing, in part because they wanted to be a bigger chunk all at once. So they might say, you don't really know that this peaceful mountain retreat is all that great, or you don't know everything about the city or about Thai culture in my example. And that would be true. But that glimpse still gives you knowledge. When you spot a difference, no matter how small, you know that there's a difference, right? If you look at, I've talked to the past, if you look at two paintings that are clearly different, you can know that they're clearly different. That doesn't mean you know everything about either or each painting. There's a difference between knowing everything about one or both paintings versus being able to correctly and certainly identify that they are in fact different. So a distinction can be known, but that's different than knowing everything about both sides of the distinction. I could get a glimpse at how important clarity and seeking understanding could be without really knowing that much about understanding and how it works. And so can you. And so have you, most or all of you, a lot of you, because most or all of you have been with me in the past, right? We're just about to open up a new season of our coaching. And so pretty much everyone that's eligible for this webinar has been with us for at least one season, if not more. So presumably for nearly all of you that are online. So I'm pointing out here that a glimpse then of understanding and the concept of it is knowledge. It's real knowledge. You notice, oh, that's something new. It doesn't match a total, whatever the glimpse is versus having not glimpsed that. If you saw this peaceful mountain retreat, you've never seen a place that peaceful before. And this is all just a hypothetical example. I don't in any way mean to, I'm not promoting Thailand or mountain retreats here, just a mental picture. But if so, and nor am I saying that's the only place you can find peace or whatever. But if a person had never seen peace like that and then they glimpsed it, then that's analogous, parallel to what I'm talking about with someone that glimpses the idea of the potential importance of seeking understanding and how it can be the basis or starting point for an answer of how you can organize all of your thoughts and actions and progress and achieve and seeking results and trying to win or winning. And so to this day, that hasn't steered me wrong. Like I have no fundamental correction for that basic idea about seeking understanding of what's true and good and important. I have additional, perhaps better ways of explaining it now. but that glimpse remains powerful and true, like at least as a glimpse or a starting. It still encompasses the basis for law of implication. Okay, I wrote and the basis for what I mean by method. And that's where you can have this unshakable confidence. Not that you're already, not even that your method is already right, but there can be aspects that are already right. Again, like that glimpse of pursuing clarity. There's a way that as a basic idea or glimpse or starting point, that's correct. And you can have confidence in that. And you can build on that, and many of you have, right? You have more thoughts about that than just the starting thought. And most everything I talk about will be related to that method, and how a source is ultimately comes down to trying to turn gray into black and white, like a gray area into black and white, or something that's inside of various frames and assumptions and environmental assumptions and so forth, like a cake recipe, and act like that's a method, act like it's the whole thing. Like it might in practice be all you need, but that would be by luck, like I talked, where all the stuff you're assuming and not noticing about outer frames and such turn out to effectively not matter. It's also going to turn out that the type of thinking and power and method and stuff that we talk about in law of implication is going to give you the most practical advantage when the less there's overlap between what we're assuming about overall frames or mental assumptions and the environment being similar regarding a particular person's advice or a particular template or method or past memory of how we can do things. The more there's an effective overlap, the less advantage you're going to get from all of this, and the less overlap there is with the outer frames and such, the more your outer boxes are not going to be effective for you in a particular situation or for someone else, then the more you need this. And the more in a particular niche or genre, the more kind of open-ended it is that way. The less the common knowledge and assumptions are effectively correct, then the more advantage, right? You could reliably win pretty much all the time when a bunch of hidden assumptions that can be off. I would say that there's a way that you can vary regarding making money. There's a way that you can making money as a whole is like that, where there's often not a lot of overlap. And I think that people that make a lot of money without understanding what we're talking about here mostly got lucky and then are trying to talk as if they didn't, right? They don't see it that way because this thing I'm talking about, source, where it's everything to people to believe in a source, because there's no such, if there's no such thing as method as I mean it, right? To our brain by default, there's no such thing as clarity in the way that the method in the way that it takes conscious awareness and such. So once there's no such thing as method, source is all you have. It's literally your only hope and your only quote unquote method is the recipe, right? There's no method, so there's just some recipes, and people call those methods, and they call them strategies. And so, but source is all there is, and so people must cling to it for survival. And I mean that literally, because our default thinking is we're literally designed to survive, both as individuals and then as a species, right? We're designed by by the creator to survive. And plus, we're designed with what we need to harness, not just to survive, but to survive in a way that we have something to harness in order to have free will. That's the whole point of everything, which we can then use to care about people and be happy and such. Be happy in a way that's even greater than just what would be the equivalent of a drug-induced bliss. God could create everyone in a state of perpetual survival that was imposed by God and with a state of perpetual bliss. But there would be no room for any free will, and therefore no room for any love. And that would be lesser than than the joy and happiness, pleasure and stuff that we get if we get to the same place, but by participating in it with our free will. So that's what God has obviously chosen to do, is not have us in the equivalent of a drug-induced bliss that allows for no free will. And that's the only two alternatives. So there's a default functioning that programs us so that we survive without any kind of active awareness and conscious participation on our parts, relatively well, right? Not perfectly, but relatively well. But as good as you're going to do from an algorithm, essentially. And as part of that, gray needs to be turned to black and white, right? Instead of a staticky image with a blind spot in our where our optic nerve goes to our retina and so forth, and a bunch of fuzzy stuff. If you were to try to take, if you were to, they can create an image these days of what would, like a mock-up of what would be shown just by a retina. Instead of that, we get a more of a crisp image that we feel confident in. And then metaphorically, that happens with so many of our beliefs and assumptions. And it makes a certain type of sense, as I refer to. If there's no such thing as method in the way that, then that's what your brain by default is operating off of. And so it needs that false sense of confidence, but it needs to present it as not false. So it's falsely turning gray to black. And if you're going to do that, you need to prevent the observer from realizing that's what you're doing in the first place. So there's a circular protection that's in place. And that's in one way of characterizing the entire barrier or issue. And it's all necessary. None of it is God or whatever else. None of it's designed wrong. It's all designed properly. It's all logically necessary. But then we need to interact with it and harness it in the right way and understand the limitations of our brain by default as an algorithm. All of this is to get results. All this is to win. All this is critical for day-to-day practical stuff. All right. Let me go on here to progress versus winning and give an indication of what I mean by that. This is another one. Source thing is extraordinarily powerful. It's going to ensnare everybody and snare people powerfully. And so that's one of my huge goals, is to help you actually have such clarity that it defeats that strong illusion. Again, the illusion is necessary. It's a necessary consequence of the way everything has to be designed. But it's then necessary that we're equipped to overcome the illusion as well. We must. But it's going to feel very powerful until we have the clarity that kind of dissolves it a little bit. You might have a software, it might have recommended settings or highly recommended update or any sort of recommendation. But the minute you find out that the recommendation is really clearly that the person who's recommending it is just doing it to make more profit. I'm saying hypothetically, if that was the case, I'm not saying all recommendations are that way. But if, let's say there's a recommended such and such by some software or by whatever, by your computer, when you buy one and it says, we recommend you get, and then you would feel a tug like, I'm not sure if I should trust them, but there's a tug, right? You feel like maybe that's important. But the minute you find out that it's definitely just a profit motive and no other reason, then totally gets rid of that power, right? When you're not sure, that recommendation might have some power. Or if you feel like the recommendation is definitely just in your best interest. But the minute you found out, hypothetically, for sure, that the recommendation was purely just because the person making the recommendation wanted to make more money, then you would assign it no power. And that's a lot like when you have enough clarity about this process of wanting confidence in a source, right? A source can be another person, a template, a memory, a recipe, a way of doing things, a habit, a belief, a government, a religious document. Again, just like a cake recipe can effectively be correct, right? Obviously, things that sources say can end up being correct. I'm not saying we should never follow a cake recipe, just like I'm not saying that writing in a religious document is necessarily incorrect. But there's a way that relying on it without applying clarity as an alternative to clarity is definitely wrong. Clarity is going to lead you to truth always. And a source is going to not lead you to truth each and every time. Every single assumption in your mind translating the religious revelation can be off in your own mind, right? Assumptions, environment, whatever it might be, can lead you astray. And even if it is true, the only way you could figure out that it's true is via clarity, via method, right? So method will never lead you, and a source will sometimes or often lead you wrong. And the process of needing to confirm a source, we all know this with how difficult it is to correct other people ourselves, right? We know that if we need to correct somebody else if we're above them in some way in a career, I don't mean above them morally, I just mean practically speaking in a career, we know that it's uncomfortable. Might have to be done, but it's uncomfortable. Why? Right? This is the reason, this is the only reason. Obviously productive in that case. Okay, so just as that is so very powerful and the illusion is so very strong and so very sure to snare, right? Basically everyone that begins hearing this or that doesn't as well. Same thing with progress. Progress, believe it or not, is a useless. It's useless in the same way that a source is useless. Of course, it can be useful, but it's beside the point. Method, by the way, of course, uses source as raw material. So of course you use sources, but as raw material on which to apply a method, on which to gain distinctions and therefore clarity. So of course you use them to harness sources, such as even myself, right? By the way, so imagine that you were to try to rely on me incorrectly as a source. Then even if I'm awesome, it's counterproductive, even from my point of view, in trying to help you, from your point of view as well. But even from my point of view, I don't want that because you will be way less likely to succeed because you're approaching me passively, right? To be simplistic, but to use reasonable words here, instead of active, instead of using what I say as raw material, not to question or not. It's not that you need to correct what I say or not. That's not besides the point of what I'm saying. Of course, I work hard to make sure that what I say is correct, but I can't possibly make it correct by the time your mind interprets it because I don't have full clarity and understanding of your mind and the translation mechanism and like the nuances of words and so forth. I can't do that. It's not even possible for me. And it would mean that you'd be passive in the wrong way and give up responsibility to me in a way that would be counterproductive for both of us. It's harder on me and harder on you and less likely for you to successfully harvest the bounty from the raw material that I give you. So even for me, I don't want to be your source. I want to be now raw material can be more or less pure. And if you give someone particularly good raw materials, then they're going to be much better off. Right. So again, I work hard to be great raw materials. In other words, to be the best, practically speaking, the best source I can be for you. But even then, there's a limit to how much I understand, of course. Right. Both about how to explain it and even about these concepts themselves. Right. I can have all sorts of useful distinctions without yet having the full picture, which is the case, right? And why should that hold you back? Why should my lack of distinctions that I still have hold you back from making distinctions I haven't made? So for every reason, you want to approach me in that way too. So progress is similar, where of course there's plenty of times when progress overlaps with what you do want. But what happens is the way that our mind works is by making association, right? And it ends up substituting those associations for truth and what we want and goals and so forth, our objectives and our real target. So your mind by now is going to be associating all sorts of things associated with progress with pleasure. And as a general rule, it's trying to confirm itself and other things that it already believes as a source, right? If you're trying to confirm a guru that you respect greatly as a source, that ends up being the same thing as confirming yourself as a source, right? Because your trust in that guru is what's being confirmed as well, right? So it always comes down to relying on yourself, your own mind as a source, right? Of pure, unnecessary processed truth, which is not the progress. And coming to this webinar, if I were to just talk assumptively about progress being good and desirable, then people would just implicitly agree with me in most cases, probably. I've referred to it before a little bit. I'm not saying that it's impossible that independently or because of things that I've indicated, perhaps you would disagree, but I think there's a way that it so ensnares all of us is the assumption that progress is desire. And it's really besides the point for progress to be desirable. And as a matter of fact, when it becomes a sort of end, what it does is it ends up being like carbon monoxide, where the reason why carbon monoxide is poisonous is why? Because it's substitute for oxygen, if I have my chemistry and biology, biochemistry right, in your red blood cell, right, in the hemoglobin. And it'll bind to where the oxygen is supposed to bind, and therefore make it so it can't bind oxygen and can't breathe. If there's enough of it, you're going to die. Progress substitutes for winning. And it relates to confirming, right? We want to confirm that we're already right. It's similar to we want to confirm that we're making progress. We want to feel like we're winning already. And that is detrimental for two reasons. One is it gets in the way of of a real target, which is winning, things that might look like progress, we tend to favor stop like getting opt-ins in my business, right? As opposed to just actually making money or sales instead of successful customers, right? Whatever it might be, if it's progress instead of whatever the end target is, that should, as I've referred to before, end up revealing itself, not just be set, right? Setting a goal is another example of trying to turn gray into black and white. Anything that starts, any advice or success methodology that starts with the idea of setting goals begins with the incorrect assumption about first we need to take gray and turn it black and white, and then we proceed from there. No, that's always the wrong way to start, is to take gray and turn it into black and white. Black and white reveal themselves as black and white, not, you don't stare at gray and project onto it black and white. But that is what happens when people set goals. And people that are setting more clear and written and big goals is just a way to make the gray seem more black and white, more false confidence. False confidence, like heroin. If you're a heroin addict, then heroin's good, right? Circuit. If the only way you can move forward is through false confidence, then you might as well have false confidence rather than just be depressed, right? So it's a local peak. It looks effective, but it's also like heroin. You need more and more of it, and you get less and less result, and your deficit spending, and then that catches up with you, right? Feeding false confidence has all sorts of costs. And so it's a lot like getting addicted to a harmful drug. It's almost exactly identical in essence to being hooked on heroin, is to be hooked on false confidence. And progress is a big part of that. How do we feel? How do we feed our false confidence is through progress. And progress takes over like carbon monoxide, and it ends up becoming effectively the goal, what our mind is going to give us desire and motivation for, and dopamine, pleasure for, and so forth, to which has all sorts of negative consequences. The obvious one about you're simply no longer focused on the actual target that should reveal itself. You no longer, if you set a goal, now you're no longer even interested in revealing the real target that would actually help you permanently by achieving it. So it takes your eye off the real goal. You'll be biased towards achievements that can be easily seen and measured, making you even more likely to want to set goals that then you can see, oh, how many sales do you expect to make, or what, how much money do you expect to make in 6 months? So you just start doing all kinds of counterproductive things, and then you'll even sabotage. You can see this with money getting, relationships, whatever. People want to make progress, and so what's a good way to make progress? Up a hill. If you're stuck on a local hill, then the only way to if you think your goal is to climb higher, then the only way to climb higher is to find hidden ways that you yourself don't even notice, right? Like subconscious ways to get back down the hill so you can climb it again, because the goal becomes to climb it. So you both don't find a better hill to climb somewhere else, and you sabotage. And then furthermore, in kind of a related way, people, because they want progress, they're not satisfied. They don't enjoy winning for more than a few minutes or hours or days or whatever. So it's horrible. And yet it's the only reality for virtually everybody. So it's so powerfully taken for granted once you know how to look for it. So we have these things, the source versus method, the progress versus winning thing. And I'll talk a bit about, indicate what I mean by winning here to round this out. But this can start to give you a glimpse of what can be holding you back massively, no matter how great are the SEO recipes and how awesome what Steven's showing you. And it is awesome. I so appreciate the things that people are showing you, what Fletch has coming up and so forth. So you can have all that and you can be making money. But if you're getting waylaid with the source thing and the progress thing, there's a way that your effectiveness of making money is going to be massively retarded, held back. I just literally mean unnaturally held back when I say retarded. It's not a pejorative, no matter what else. And so this critically gives you the fuller picture. And we'll notice that even people that make a lot of money, they tend to, in so many cases that we actually know, of course, not in every case on the planet, but they have less money than me, for example, right? I've kept a tremendous amount of the money that I've made because I'm focused on winning, achieving permanent achievement that I can be content with. I don't care about the progress. I care about the goal that reveals itself. And then just sitting there, I can just sit on a goal being happy about it. That's what a real target looks like. You might think permanent. Does it have to be permanent? Yeah, because realistically, that's the case. Even a win that's semi-permanent, it only has real impact if it's like a stepping stone where it really has a permanent impact. If it didn't have a permanent impact, you probably could have worked on something else. Think about it, right? You can only work on one overall priority at a time. It might be a multifaceted project or priority, but in one sense, there's one priority, one thing, and it might be a multifaceted thing with various parts. Right? If it's making money, then there might be like your fulfillment, your product and service. There might be your traffic getting method and your sales method. You could say that you could break it. You could break your priority down into components, but overall, it's one thing that you're working on. There can only be one top priority, right? There can only be one number one, which is how I organize my time rather than traditional time management. It's very effective. But I was saying that so you can only have one priority, and so you might as well. What you're trying to find, and you're not going to do this perfectly, but the more clarity you have, the more you'll naturally do it better, is you want to prioritize that which will have the most impact on your life, right? So literally what you're trying to do is have clarity about the priority. And again, it can be a complex priority, but the priority thing that will have the most impact actually on your life. That's what you're trying to reveal, right? That project, that topic, whatever reveals itself, right? Could be understanding the nature of mind. It could be understanding and therefore achieving relationships overall, which might make you money through business relationships. The bottleneck is, right? Whatever the thing, one way or the other, it's going to impact your life the most. Then that's currently where you want to be spending your time. That's something that actually exists conceptually, right? That which is going to have the most impact on your life is not something you set. That's moronic once you look at it this way, right? It exists. And so what's going to happen is the more clarity you have that enables you to see that more clearly is how it's going to much it's going to reveal itself, which is how much you're going to both go after it and feel motivated. And you're not going to need motivation and time management as separate skills. They're all integrated. They're all natural consequences of clarity about impact, right? All you need is clarity about impact, and you will prioritize, be motivated. And especially when you understand you want clarity about clarity, and that like when clarity is on every level, your method, then once you get clarity, which could be a glimpse of what's going to have the most impact or what as far as you currently understand, you're automatically going to eyeball it and do your best guess, right? Or do something, which is all you can do. That's correct. That's not wrong. So based on your current level of clarity about what's going to have impact on your life, then you're going to be motivated and focused. And then you seek clarity inside of, right, how to achieve that target, how to win regarding that. And that's it. That's what you're doing. And again, part of achieving clarity is you break that down into more bite-sized things and bits and pieces and distinctions and sub-frameworks, so forth, right? If you eyeball it and think, look, if I have more money, that's one of the components. That's one of the things I clearly need right now. Or another reasonable thought is to think, eyeballing it, it looks like I want to make more money and I don't see something that's going to have a bigger impact. So I might as well take action on that, because taking action, as always, if you understand method and law of implication properly, what is taking action toward making money going to do? If your outer frames are right about understanding clarity, impact, and seeking clarity and so forth, then as you take action towards money and as you gain more of a framework about that and more clarity about that, you'll get more. And then that in and of itself will give you clarity on whether that's really the thing that's going to impact you the most. Maybe you end up being wrong, but the route to figuring out that you were wrong was to go ahead and pursue that avenue, like solving a maze. All you can do if you're just trying to solve a maze and get to the center where there's a bunch of dead ends, right? Like a complex maze that's made as a puzzle, like you could imagine in a puzzle book or something. You look at a reasonable turn, which they all might be reasonable, right? As far as you can tell. And then you go down one. If you come to a dead end, then that increased your clarity about now you only have two, you go back to the four before the dead end. And now that either there's one or more directions and you head down one of those. You try to eyeball and pick the one that looks like it's most promising. And then you pursue it. But it overall, if you understand, have clarity about the law of implication, right? Which is about clarity and its basis, then everything serves clarity. So you're always coming out ahead because you're the overall goal of gaining clarity until we what? There's actually an end to it. It's not infinite progress. There's an end, which is to dissolve all bad ideas. Bad ideas are finite. They can all be dissolved. They're not necessary. Good stuff, you can always potentially create more. You can create more people and you can care about those new people and create new art projects or computer games or experience. So that's open-ended. That might not be finite. There might always be more things you can do there. But in terms of getting rid of bad ideas, that's finite. That they can all potentially be dissolved through clarity. And then at least there's a clear end goal. Obviously, we want to dissolve as many bad ideas as possible. And then we like to have clarity on what leads to good. And currently more clarity can be gained, and so we want more clarity. If somehow we get so much clarity that it reveals itself, that's no longer the bottleneck in some way. Clarity about dissolving bad ideas or making good stuff is somehow not the bottleneck, then that will reveal itself. But currently, it's fairly obvious that's the way to go, right? Unless someone presents you with some credible alternative. So that's winning, is a goal or an ends or whatever, an end state reveals itself, or a glimpse of something reveals itself. If you see going back to my mental picture of peacefulness, and I'm not really promoting peacefulness or not. Of course, there's something to peacefulness that's desirable, but it's not really about that. It's just a simple illustration. So you don't have to have a full understanding of what the wind looks like in order to have it start to reveal itself and therefore go for it. Just like you don't have to know exactly what it looks like to have enough money. You can have a glimpse of it and you can have a fairly filled in picture of it. I've filled in some things. Perhaps it looked like having an annuity or annuity-like situation where you're having such and such thousands a month coming in starting when you're 60 or 65 or 62 and a half. And then you have enough to get yourself. Maybe that's what it looks like. That gives you an additional distinctions when I say that. It's not necessarily full clarity. It's not even necessarily fully correct, but there's more distinction to me saying that than to me not saying. We no longer want to be addicted to progress, and progress should be, in essence, irrelevant. Our mind is going to go after, another way to put it is our mind is going to go after progress naturally. We don't need to undo that any more than we need to undo the fact that visually and conceptually, but let's just say visually right now, our mind makes things look more crisp and clear than they really are when they hit our retina. You don't need to keep things with static or fuzziness. Instead, we use it all as raw material. We're not trying to add fuzziness back in. I'm not trying to turn black and white into gray, except to label it as, right? Like it's useful to be aware that we technically have a blind spot, because when does it come up, especially when driving, right? And that's an example of what I said. In a practical matter, if I'm walking around the room, the fact that there's a blind spot where the optic nerve crosses the retina doesn't matter. Why? Because, as an example of what I mean by when I say practically speaking, the assumptions that we're taking for granted don't matter, right? The outer box is the hidden assumptions. Like in this case, the hidden assumption is that there's no blind spot, right? Like until we learn biologically that there's a blind spot, we wouldn't guess that probably because we don't experience it, right? I didn't know, right? That there's an optic nerve went through the retina and technically created a blind spot in our vision until I learned it, right from biology. So it doesn't matter until it matters. And then it matters potentially with driving, where when you're checking and there could be a car in your blind spot, then you want to look from two different angles, right? Maybe a rear view mirror and your side view, or at least physically move forward and backwards in your seat when you're looking through your rear view mirror on the side, right? To see if there's a car there. maybe supplement that. These days, some cars have a little alarm or something regarding that. But that's a great illustration, mental picture for you of what's going on all the time everywhere. But I've listed plenty of blind spots in the past and will continue to that are very impactful, right, in a practical way, constantly. And these things about source and progress are like massively wrong assumptions about how things should work that are holding you back. Again, whenever they don't overlap with what's going to actually be effective, right? Sometimes the default way of just setting goals and making progress works, but it breaks down all the time. Simple example that comes to mind, this one having to do with parenting, right? When a person has a goal for what they want to do in the next hour, either your child or you or both, then that the goal is set, not revealed in most cases. And then that'll easily lead to frustration, either on the part of the child or the parent or both. And in many cases, that's unnecessary if the blind spot is understood and dealt with, just the same way you move back and forth in your seat or whatever, in order to make sure there's no one in your blind spot, the same way you make sure, wait a second, am I acting as if a goal that is really important, can frustrate me because the child is resisting it or just doesn't want to do it, or is it just going to lead to kind of misery for my child, relative misery, and an overall sense of wrongness from the parent that over the years is going to lead to more and more rebellion in a way that's going to be unhelpful when I have genuinely good advice to give, and I sabotage that good advice by being silly regarding day-to-day goals. Same thing with coworkers, right? Same type of thing can happen. We get these things in our mind that we feel like we want. They're goals that are set, not revealed. A revealed goal won't lead to frustration, especially when you combine it with getting rid of your addiction to progress. When a goal is revealed and when you understand that the method of achieving your goal is based in gaining clarity until you win. And again, you don't need to gain more and more clarity. You gain clarity until you win, right? Like you pursue the revealed goal until you achieve it. And what does pursuing look like? Fundamentally, it looks like gaining clarity. So gaining clarity is synonymous with pursuing a revealed goal. So you do gain clarity towards a revealed goal until you achieve the goal, the state that that you had a glimpse of or whatever, which is often getting over a threshold, which means it's not about perfection, right? If you're jumping a high jump, right? That's my mental picture for threshold, is getting over a high jump bar, right? Perfection is getting over the bar, not jumping as high as you possibly could. Just need to get over the bar, whatever that might be. Like, for example, with making money, for example, with finding a temporary or permanent mate for a love relationship, whatever it is, they don't have to be perfect. They don't have to be the best there possibly could be. You just need to get over a bar, but a bar that reveals itself as the right bar. So two massively problematic assumptions: source versus the method, right? Getting fooled by the source-based thinking and progress-based thinking. And so these are huge takeaways that if we accomplish those two takeaways, and then I'm not saying that on this last thing where I write clarity about impact, I'm not saying that I want you just to have clarity about impact, but I want you to understand those two concepts about clarity, about what it means. Like, not that I want you to have clarity about impact or importance. Of course, that's nice. But I want you to understand what the concept is, the glimpse, the idea of that. The way that you win in each and every case is, first of all, you let the win reveal itself and you make it not about progress, right? And then you apply a method, which is all about gaining clarity, everything, your thinking, your planning, your actions, right? Taking action. It all ultimately serves clarity, distinctions, building more just relevant distinctions and stuff. And at the very basis of the idea of clarity, and then the next thing is about what is going to have the most impact, what plans and therefore actions are going to have more impact, right? You have a limited resources, so it's always going to be about impact, right? So clarity, and then the next thing right under clarity has to do with impact. The first thing you're getting clarity about is impact. And then it breaks down from there in a good way where you're just more details. But details are going to give you more clarity about what choices are going to have the most impact, right? You can ultimately parse all of your pursuit of winning into correctly guessing and therefore doing actions, right, which are plucked from thought, which have more impact rather than less, right, towards your goal, or rather than a negative impact, of course, right? You don't want to have thoughts and actions that are either irrelevant or counterproductive. And ideally, you'd want to take the actions that have the most impact, right? You'd want to say the things to people that most would have the greatest impact on them becoming your customer, right, or client. But you don't need to, you're going to win inevitably, regardless of whether you start out by guessing all the right thoughts and actions that have the most impact. Because whatever you do in the sales process, for example, it can all serve clarity if you're not blocked by the confidence trap, believing in yourself, believing you're already right, needing to confirm that you're already awesome, right? That you as a source and other sources that you believe in or are acting on or have at your hand are correct. You're not trying to corroborate that. But by default, that's what's going to happen. Default, one thing that I also want you to understand more and more is default is not bad. You're not trying to stop, again, the using of sources or seeking progress in a certain way. In one way you are, in another way you're not. You're trying to harness the fact that your mind does that by default properly, right? If we reframe progress as progress towards clarity until we win, then that's correct. The until we win is critical. The clarity part of what I said is critical about progress being understood to be all about clarity and clarity about what's going to have the most impact. That's great, but don't stop there. It's also critical that progress is tied to an end point. Otherwise, what happens? The sabotage, the dissatisfaction. Why should you're going to hear all sorts of advice, right, in the success writings world. Oh, don't be satisfied. You want to be dissatisfied, right? If you're satisfied, you'll get complacent. You won't take action. That's circularly correct in the kind of heroin sense. Of course, you want to reveal the final win. You inherently aren't going to be satisfied until, if you understand correctly, you won't be ultimately satisfied or call it a win until we dissolve bad ideas, right? At which point you'll happily be creating new good experiences that you're eternally satisfied with in the past, and then make new ones that also are satisfying, right? You don't make new ones because the previous ones are dissatisfying at that point. You just make new ones because out of making new ones. If I can hug someone that's satisfying and then I can hug them again, and that sucks. I'm dissatisfied with the previous hug, right? You see what I mean? So you don't ever need dissatisfaction. What you do need to do is accurately reveal the correct end's goal, which as far as I understand currently, and it's either this or something that's going to reveal itself more accurately, right? Which is dissolving bad ideas. And then of course, naturally creating more good, right? Understanding more of what leads to good. And we don't necessarily need to understand more of what leads to good. We might just understand what leads to good, period. Not need to understand more and just keep doing it. You see what I mean? So again, we want to be careful about putting something in a way that assumes you always need progress when that's not necessarily fascinating, right? About progress. Probably hitting a lot of you hard in a cool way, right? So progress should never be open-ended. It should be related to clarity, and it should terminate with the final win and with intermediate win. When I say intermediate wins, when an intermediate potential win reveals itself, such as getting money taken care of, then again, the idea isn't to progress with making money, but the idea is to progress with clarity up until you win regarding money. That's what I mean by that. Cool. Very real, very much what I live by and do in practice. This isn't like some theory I have, and very much thought through for many years. So these are the takeaways, and I spent a while talking about this. And so that can be my monologue for this webinar. I'll give you a glimpse of the next slide, where ultimately cause and effect are going to be intimately and logically related to everything we want on a day-to-day level, on an ultimate level, on a thing about what leads us to be successful and happy overall. But it's also going to be very practical in terms of little achievements that you're trying to do. David, I just want to do this in the particular thing, this kind of sub goal that's, you might think of it as mundane, but it's practical. I want it right now. Understanding cause and effect properly, including, see what's going on is, like I said, where the blind spot example, the blind spot doesn't matter when it doesn't matter, when the practical overlap between not knowing about the blind spot is the same as if I did know about the blind spot, right? If I'm walking around my room, then knowing about the blind spot probably doesn't matter. And therefore, practically speaking, it doesn't matter. When it does matter, then it does matter. And it could matter. It could be life or death, right? Property right as a basis for negative morality, or however you want to call it, doesn't matter until it matters huge, right? In our day-to-day life, dealing with our friends, it might not end up mattering. I might not be making decisions where that understanding really matters. And my general assumptions in our culture might be sufficient for interacting in a constructive, moral way with my friends, right? But when it comes to political decisions, right, where it accounts for 25 to 40 or more, 45, 50 by the time you do state tax of our money and other related things, then it becomes critically important. So I'm not saying these things matter but matter when they do and don't matter when they happen not to by luck. But there's a whole number of impactful ideas that understanding cause and effect properly, not like, I'm not just talking about, someone might say a conversation without understanding anything about what I'm talking about with LOI. They might say, oh, you don't really understand cause and effect. And they mean in a particular subtopic area of life when it comes to phishing or ranking a website or marketing or whatever. And I don't mean like that. I mean, in a very basic way, a parallel to this would be like with love. In a very practical sense that matters for both your main romantic relationship and other relationships, understanding having clarity regarding love is practically very helpful and important. And the reason that practically is important is because the default set of assumptions and stuff does not effectively match, right? It's like with a blind spot when driving. Like you're going to have a crash. If you have the default sense of the common sense of love and what it means and the common distinctions and lack of distinctions about it, you're very likely headed for a crash. Now, for some people, they're not in their romantic relationships. That's an example when they mostly works. Just they get lucky and all the assumptions and frames and environment ends up being right, including kind of the experiences and what ends up happening to their spouse and themselves up until when they die, all works out. But for nearly all of us, and even for those people, probably they would have been better off. Same thing with cause and effect. In a very practical way, there's all sorts of crashes you're going to run into in your day-to-day money getting, relationships, and dealing with your own mind and motivation and time management and priorities, and dealing with all sorts of stuff, certainly with kids. Can't be doing that with parenting and so forth. The common understanding of cause and effect is going to cause a train wreck nonstop. And it's going to relate to the basics of LOI, right? And if we're talking about, I want to achieve goals, I want to be successful, I want to make money, then figuring out what causes one to make money versus not is going to matter. And not just on a symptomatic level, like seeing how the basic illusion that our mind has by default about cause and effect and seeing how that illusion works. And it screws us constantly, in effect, in a kind of a day-to-day practical way, including with making money. It messes us up predictably. And my more correct understanding, my more useful distinctions about cause and effect are very practical, useful to me, and it all logically is very intimately related with kind of the basic frames of life regarding clarity, importance, all that stuff. So that's where I'll get to next week, presumably. Okay, that's good for the monologue, so to speak. And we can talk to each other a little bit here. I'll do a little refresh. See if I can get rid of the naked butt. Oh my goodness, what do you know? The ad is gone. It didn't show up this time. Okay. There was a question early on. Do I have any tips on how to execute better strategy, especially with disregarding importance as a source? Disregarding importance. Yeah. I'll look to keep filling that in. I don't have any thoughts like immediately about that. But overall, that's a big part of what I'm going to when I talk about impact. On my slide about takeaways, I said clarity about impact is one of the main things that I want to keep on filling in. Probably I said a whole number of things already on this webinar that related to or gave you either quite usable ideas, raw material, or at least a raw material for working on that. In essence, the entire method is rooted in clarity in gaining, using everything, your thinking, your planning, your actions, feedback, other people's responses as you interpret them and so forth, how things seem to you as raw material for gaining clarity. And a hint about clarity is this idea of glimpses and distinction, as opposed to needing, feeling like you don't have clarity just because you don't know everything about the new thing that you glimpsed. All right. I was skipping stuff I referred to earlier in the beginning. Brian says, "Hi, David. Just landed back in the office. I'm so excited to hear what you have in store for us all. Thank you for all your forethought, concept compilation, most of all for sharing with us." You're very welcome, Brian. Let me just, I'm not even going to turn off the camera right there. I'm just going to run quickly and get a big bright drink over. Drink it straight out of the bottle here. A little cold brew espresso. Dave Hughes said, "This is extremely profound to me." All right. Responding to the confidence in the source. Yeah, no doubt that's hitting you guys in this webinar, despite everything I've said in the past. It is such a powerful trap. And a lot of what I'm doing in this series is hopefully really hammering on these critical traps and forks in the road, deceptive, wrong forks in the road that are very, very easy misinterpretations or things that are going to keep you, no matter how much else you get from me, keep you from really getting to the good stuff or the real full benefit. Dave says, "This is extremely profound to me. A confidence in source versus method was there all the time, but it's like I just saw it for the first time." Excellent. That's exactly what I'm going for. Beautiful. So glad to hear that. Dave Q says that the brain actually has to reconstruct what you just saw, and it does it in pieces. Good. Further building on that mental image. Light, black and white, color, shape, everything is processed several to many milliseconds after it already happened. We're still in the dark, except we put together a picture to understand it. Yeah. Fletch says, "Having myself not be the source has been a big issue I hadn't really seen before now." Yeah, no, I really, there's two things, the source thing and the progress, the trap. I think I've become aware, I feel like, mostly through my own thinking. But I'm like, these have got to be, I've come nowhere near both stressing the importance and building enough clarity about those two big things that are total blocks and traps. It's an LOI, get fully grasping and benefiting from LOI, for myself included, is like in one sense, like a combination lock, right? Where you need a bunch of tumblers in place and you can really get blocked from the opening the lock if any of the tumblers are not in place. However, there's one thing that's not captured in that mental image. There's one way that mental image is too negatively misleading. Each new tumbler, I think, that is put in place, you do get a glimpse of more, right? So you do get something, but there's a way that you're really locked out of the fullness of it for sure if you don't have all the tumblers in place. And these are critical ones that I'm harping on. I hope to get them, at least all the ones that I've figured out, in place for you guys, which certainly leads to a lot. Dave Key has really agreed with Fletch there. It allows you to reach beyond your present capabilities, doesn't it? The framework will get you there. Michael Long says, David, referring to myself, had an understanding line lesson he taught in our initial Magic the Gathering coaching project. Yeah, exactly. Before LOI, we had the Magic the Gathering collectible card game, the strategy game, and then website business that we made later on based on our professional career. And we had a book. And I wrote the first part of each chapter, like I said, the ideas. And Mike expanded and gave examples, and it was good. But yeah, I talked about that from early on. And it's always been a huge beacon for me, that, and it's never changed. And of course, for you guys too, you've heard me talk about that and gained a lot from it. Source only thinking, says Dave Key, Carl Sagan, the cosmos is all that is or was or ever will be, a universe without reason. Yeah, exactly. Like when you don't take into account the possibility of that conscious method, we could say. But the problem with saying conscious method and so forth, again, it's easy to misinterpret and project when people talk about you have to be more conscious or consciousness. It's easy to have all of those words and that terminology and that teaching and still not really get the real distinction that I'm trying to get you to. But I think we'll avoid that. I think we'll get there where you can really see the difference. I'm going to keep, as I continue with the slides that I have and as I continue to think of related angles on this, I really want to nail that down so we don't get locked in the source only thinking. We're always harnessing and getting raw materials from sources. That's including our own mind, right? That's all the raw material we have to work with in essence. But it needs to be further processed through a method. And trying to find raw material to use as is another way to put what we don't want to do. Dave says, you mean the Nicene Creed or the canon? When I was referring to religious, like revelations or texts. You mean like the canon are alternatives to better clarity, right? You don't use any raw material. Everything is raw material, basically, and you don't use it in place of clarity. It doesn't matter. Of course, they had a very hard time. Christians would understandably be very leery, but logically they should be able to grasp that if the Bible could impose truth upon you, then you shouldn't have to read it in your language. Why would you have to read it in English or whatever language you speak if it was true, right? What it mean, of course, it can be great raw material. It can be perfect raw material. But if I give you absolutely pure water, but then the only thing you have is like a cup that already has some water in it, right? Then it doesn't matter that I gave you pure water. You still need to repurify it afterwards if you want pure water, right? If I can give you water that would not only be pure, but would somehow purify whatever water you had, that would be magic, right? And as far as we know, that type of thing doesn't exist. And conceptually, right see, God could do that to us. That's within God's capability to impose truth upon us in that way, but not without stripping our free will. And that which has the cascade effect of stripping any chance of love and abundance, right? Obviously, God chose to create a universe with free will. And then obviously, once we understand God, then that we could also understand that was the correct decision to do. But regardless, it is what's going on. That's a nice mental image though, right? What a source doesn't do is purify what you have, even if it's pure. You have to participate in the purification, right? You're always mixing your own mind with any concept, right? And any kind of recipe of action to take is going to mix with the environment, right? Which can't be perfectly predicted typically. We can guess, right? And Greg's ranking formula basically works all the time, everywhere. Because why? Because as it turns out, it's a pretty good choice. I chose it on purpose, SEO, because it's duplicatable, because the environment, you might say, doesn't Google change. Greg keeps on top of that. And SEO is very duplicatable as opposed to, say, trying to duplicate a conversion funnel is going to predictably fail pretty fast. Right? Even your own, right? Even your own conversion funnel that's working is going to cease to work in many cases. Either the audience will have already seen it, the environment will change culturally, psychologically, whatever. Other people will copy it if it's so effective, and that'll dilute the usefulness of that, and et cetera, et cetera. So teaching conversion as a meta thing is useful, and I do it. But and there's some use to giving specific conversion recipes, but relying on that is predictably going to not work with people. And so it's never going to be a standalone. Whereas with SEO, practically speaking, it's going to be duplicatable. And it's funny because Jesus himself, or ironic, Jesus himself constantly, first of all, the one and only thing he berates people for is hypocrisy, which is like self-contradiction, right? Relates to, like, he doesn't criticize people for not following a source, including even himself, in a way of speaking, if you get the right interpretation of what I'm saying. He criticizes them for not following the own source that they themselves are saying is correct, if you look. Furthermore, if you look for it, he criticizes people for not seeking understanding and even taking himself literally. When he says, he tells the disciples, beware the yeast of the Pharisees. And then they're like, oh, we shouldn't eat their bread. And he's, what are you talking? Why don't you think about what I'm saying? I'm being metaphorical. If you wanted people to unthinkingly just impose truth upon people, then that wouldn't be in there, right? That wouldn't be an example. I believe Jesus is a pure source, right? But since it's mixed with our minds, we have to use it and think. How could it be possible that God would not want us to seek clarity, right? It's all necessary. So when it's used as an excuse not to seek clarity, which in practice, that's how Christians use their texts, is as an excuse not to seek clarity, not to think. And that's also, when one thinks that has to be wrong. Right? If the Pharisees replied to Jesus, because a lot of you may not feel like Christianity is relevant, but I'm talking about this because it's just an illustration of the overall concept, right? Anyway, but why wouldn't Jesus have said, when he said, beware the yeast of the Pharisees, then he should have been like, why didn't you just take, it's not even literally, but taking the unthinking, the phrase taking it literally can be misinterpreted. But I take what Jesus says literally. I don't take it as like an allegory, but I take it as I need to seek clarity about what Jesus meant. And that, in terms of practical action, that was a significant part of my journey and figuring all this stuff out, including stuff that I used to make money and everything, have great relationships and so forth, was letting kind of the things that Jesus said break my box or help point out assumptions that didn't, because he said things that don't fit into our worldview, including that don't fit into Christians' worldview as they stand. Funny. But they don't let Jesus' statements break their own thinking and reveal their own wrong assumption that they force fit and don't ignore, some things that Jesus says just because they don't, or project a simple interpretation on something. Megan Lee says, this distinction of clarity versus source regarding relying on method for clarity rather than relying on a source, which is raw material, is fantastic. Really helps understand it. Yeah, I'm very excited about bringing this to you and making sure that we develop it in the coming series. A big part of my motivation in doing this series. So no matter where we search, every source needs to be tested with correct methods to truly know something. Yeah, and really, there's no test that should ever lead you to conclude that a source is then accurate in the future. And I think you meant that, but I want to clarify for everyone. And what you said has a nuance that allows me to point this out, right? It's a very important thing. People say, oh, I test my sources, but then they'll test it to see, and then their conclusion will be, now it's a trustworthy source. So I'm going to, now in the future, I don't use that. Instead, what a source, including myself, can do is help you to see distinctions, including giving you one distinction is just giving you a recipe. Greg says, do this and this, and then to rank. Then each of those lists, the recipe that he gives you, is something you might not have noticed before, or that you might not have given priority, or noticed that glimpse that maybe I priority. And then if it works, then keep doing it. But that doesn't mean that everything Greg says in the future is necessarily going to be right. There's no reason, there's no benefit to thinking. You'll easily do the right thing when it comes to Greg. Nothing about what I'm saying would lead you to do anything with what Greg says, except for to apply it and use that to increase your own clarity about ranking. But you'll only increase your own understanding and innovation and creativity and effectiveness. And I would do this naturally, like breathing, is even if every single thing he says works, I still want to get a sense of, I'll do it. And then I'll be looking to understand why it works and let it lead to more clarity and more distinction. It's not clarity to be like, oh, now I know what worked, right? You might know what's working or what's worked up till now. And of course, by eyeballing it, you would keep doing that, right? But conversion process is working, I'll keep using it, right? But I'll also be looking to understand why it's working and to gain more insights about the meta of conversion from it, to gain more insights about my audience based on it working. And then that'll help me if it's working less, or to try an additional thing that might cause it to work better, right? I'm always seeking to gain clarity. And it's fairly obvious, especially over time, right? You'll get better, right? Where do you apply? And the clarity, first and foremost, is to understanding clarity itself, right? I've said that in the past in terms of understanding. And I might have said it in this webinar, I might not. But yeah, you start with clarity about clarity itself. Simultaneously, you can work on the current task at hand, the current breakthrough you're working on. Or you don't need to necessarily stop working on your current priority in order to do that, but recognize that overall you want to gain clarity about clarity. That's going to have the most overall permanent impact on your life. And then the next thing is going to be about understanding impact. And then it goes from there into more detailed specifics. Cause and effect are intimately related. Roberto, as you develop these ideas over the years, to what degree has the Bible itself led to a breakthrough in understanding the foundational things of our experience? Like the idea that you're not your body, mind, brain at all, etc. I've actually had experiences where LOI has led me to a breakthrough, and then I noticed how statements in the Bible supports it, but not vice versa. Very powerful impact. I just looked at especially what Jesus said, as recorded to have said himself, and especially things that didn't fit easily into our worldview, and especially things about faith. Jesus harped and harped on faith, so I figured it must be intimately related to the basic of what would lead to success. And like success and happiness are inextricably related, and they're also inextricably related to any individual, mundane, simple goal that you might have today, right? Or overall, or whatever, or making money, getting sick, whatever. They're all logically related, right? The same exact thing that's going to lead to success with happiness overall is gonna be the same meta method that's gonna lead to success with getting a hot chick to have sex with you, of picking the most coarse thing, right? The most kind of day-to-day, immediate type of thing, two extremes, so to speak. And so what I didn't do was assume I already understood what faith means, which is what a lot of Christians, virtually all of them, assume what it means. And their assumption about what it means is certainly contradictory, which is faith. They reframe faith to in the whole source thing, right? That faith is about looking at gray and feeling and seeing black and white. And that's framed to be like a gift, like it's extra good and extra holy or means you're extra chosen by God or gifted from God. People will say faith is a gift, and they'll literally mean knowing what you don't understand clearly, right? So you experience clarity and feel clarity where you don't actually have clarity is what they mean by faith, literally, which is an inherent contradiction or nonsense concept. And they furthermore reframe that as a gift. Christians do that. I don't think that's inherent to Christianity. And I think that Jesus actually affirmed the opposite and meant the opposite of it. And when you look for him focusing on seeking understanding and resolving contradictions and from your own thinking, I think that's in everything that Jesus is saying, right? But because he harped so much on faith, that had to be critical, and that led me more and more to seeking understanding as literally what leads to success. So for me, it was totally integral, and it came first. And the very first thing that sparked everything was the night when I was 16, and it occurred to me that if God existed, then it might be possible to actually know that rather than just have to literally guess in a way that you would never even know one way or the other. And Christians might frame that as a lack of faith, but instead, I came to understand that as faithfulness would be if there was a way to know that God existed and the nature of God, then seeking that out would be acting in. Whereas a common belief within Christianity as practiced by people, I don't mean as intended by Jesus, is like the opposite, or it's not seeking to know. And many Christians have expressed that if you were to actually know in a clear way, then there would be no room for. Whereas I turn that on its head and say, if there is a way to know, then faith would be seeking, and therefore seeking leads to finding that. And why wouldn't that be purely good and purely what God wants? So imagine you're God and you create everyone and you exist and you want people to have a relationship with you. And then there's a way to know that you exist. Wouldn't you want people to figure that out and understand it? And so I might say, why don't you just impose that upon people? That would break people. That would break free will. And I'd say, because I have a more nuanced understanding of it, it gets a little hard to explain it all at once, but I could draw that out and explain it. But the minute God starts doing stuff for us that's consciously done, there's nowhere for God to stop without being arbitrary. If God just started healing people, there seems to be some way that the prayer may lead to healing. But if God just started doing it, like imposing healing upon people all by God's self, then how would God decide who to heal and who not? Like once God started just fixing our problem, then there'd be nowhere to stop, and God would have to just fix all our problems, which would quash all free will. You see what I'm saying? So in order to allow for free will, then God has to not choreograph things. He has to set things. And I say he, or just culturally, I'm not asserting a gender to God. I always find the exit in the last place I looked in the body, Brian. But great, but it's inevitable, right? If you keep thinking and taking action through a maze and let everything lead to clarity. Now, persistent in seeking clarity is correct persistence. Other forms of persistence in practice ignore alternative use. And I have that coming up on slides. Always take right turns. Yep. That way, all that does is help you remember, right, where you've been. It's a good system for not forgetting. But if you could remember perfectly where you've been in the maze, then you wouldn't need that rule. But I agree, that's a good rule for memory. I said something amazing 29 minutes ago. Not sure what it was. Fletch says, this may be helpful for some people, but using the full method to fully dissolve the bad idea is something that has to be used. Way too many times I put the work in to learn new things, new distinctions, add clarity, but in so many ways, what it did was just add things to my brain. I see. So adding can be helpful, right? Adding new good ideas, that's fun. that feels like progress, and we get some dopamine for that and so forth. And again, there's nothing inherently wrong with progress, but it can backfire in a whole number of ways. And if, and the dissolving, Fletch is saying, is critical here. We don't just want to add ideas to our mind. We, even as they're more important, and is to dissolve bad ideas, incorrect ideas, and contradictions. And as a matter of fact, it's certain that if we start with the premise that we have at least one incorrect idea in our minds currently, then it's certain that we can't get to our final goal without dissolving, right? If there's at least one impurity, then a method that of correctly removing impurities is necessary. And there's no possible way to only add and get to where we want to get to if there's any impurities. And it's pretty obvious that we all have impurities in our minds, some incorrect ideas. Internal conflict is a symptom that assures you that there's an impurity somewhere. Yes, I asked and received. That's awesome. So I gave you, that's referring to your very initial question about gaining more insight into seeking importance, seeking understanding of importance. And so you're saying that I did cover things well. Faith says, great summary and clarifying of these critical concepts. Thank you, Faith. I appreciate that. These wrong ideas hide everywhere in our minds, it seems. Yeah, but as I continue, I'll continue to give you practical method for finding so much to creatively engage with here. Absolutely. Yeah. But the cool thing is there's also two very tangible and functional things, which is to gain more clarity about the source trap and the progress trap. It doesn't mean source is all bad or progress is all bad, of course, but to understand, have more clarity about how they can be, the incorrect usage of each of those or pursuit of those is counterproductive. Bill Cook says, I really appreciate the idea of a glimpse. Excellent. And a hat tip to this book here. I'll show you this book. To Vernon Howard and psychopictography. Is that showing up? I've referred to this in the past. There's times when I've been hesitant to fully recommend it, but I think at this point I can. Here's exactly how you want to use Vernon Howard, and I recommend reading the book. He's extremely talented at communicating a whole number of concepts that are really helpful for promoting the value of seeking understanding, having a better perspective, working on yourself and your mind. There's a way that he's passed away, and he wrote, especially in like the 70s. So his terminology is a little bit, sounds maybe new age. He may well be a secular humanist, even. His outer frames, there's a way that he can be interpreted, possibly misinterpreted, but possibly interpreted, depending on what he himself really meant. But he talks about your true self in a way that, like, that's a source of kind of insight and goodness and such versus a false self. What you don't want to do is interpret that. And he might have been making this mistake himself, who knows? But as a source, a good way to illustrate what I'm saying is that you want to keep in mind as you read them and not kind of make this mistake. And Socrates made the same mistake, I think, as far as I can tell. Socrates, of course, has also passed away, so I can't ask him. But one way or the other, it's at least potentially easy to interpret Socrates in a certain way. Where Socrates, like Socrates, as far as at least as Plato, from the writings of Plato from the quote Socrates, is either the origin of the word education, or I don't know if historically that's accurate, if that's the full origination of it or not, but certainly Socrates, from the writings of Plato, was a big proponent of the idea of educa, means to draw out in Latin. And so education is drawing out idea, as far as I can tell, the idea of Plato and from Socrates, as written by Plato, is that people have all of this knowledge and it just has to be drawn out of people. And that's in contradiction to the idea of people being a blank slate that you write on. And I really don't subscribe to either. But I do not subscribe to the idea of a true self as a source of great knowledge and truth within yourself. It's a fine and useful metaphor as long as it's used as something, if you have the right mental picture, from me in this case, not from psychophotography, it means mental pictures, and it's using a great, very effective method of giving you a whole bunch of mental pictures to illustrate various concepts, all related to the idea of seeking understanding better and working on yourself, and how that bleeds out into the most effective pursuit for practical matters. And he makes a wonderful case of how it's very practical. And so again, he's extremely effective and talented and insightful within a certain box. And it's as long as you put him within an overall frame from me, then he's especially useful. What I was going to say is the true self that I was about to give you a mental illustration of my own. And I was relating it also. So with math, if you add up 32 plus 32, right? 64. You don't draw that out of your true self. You don't draw it out of another person. Depending on how the nuance of, you could torture the language or kind of find one interpretation you can make it true. But in a real sense, you don't draw out that information. You construct it, right? So you build it through method. You don't, and before you build it, it's not there. So it's not drawn out. It's not drawn from the source of your truth. It's constructed through method. And that's ultimately the ultimate frame that you want to have. And you don't want to let anything Vernon Howard says knock you off of that. As long as you keep his stuff framed within that, you're fine. And never accidentally start thinking that the source of wisdom is within you, as long as it's not blocked or tainted by your false self and cultural ideas and all that. Anyone that says that type of thing, they're off. It's not like God didn't create us with all truth plus impurities. It's not like that. God created us with a tools and whole brain and body that are programmed to survive and give us the raw material that we need to interact with consciously. God may well have given us a beacon, some sort of place or sense of truth. And that's oddly enough, even though that's a pretty important question, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if if we purify our thinking in the right way or whatever, if there's a way that we'll feel more drawn to true ideas than otherwise. And then we'll feel a little bit like be drawn to the better raw material, so to speak, that we still, no matter what, it's an intriguing question. It's one that we'd like to believe is true, but because we always want to believe in a source, right? That makes things easy and so forth. And it may well be that if we are quiet with ourselves and somehow pray or align ourselves towards wanting to receive real truth, then feel like our feelings will start to pull us in the right direction. But as compelling as that is, it's interestingly enough, it's not really critical. It's not necessary that we're pulled in that direction. As long as we have that, as long as we ever are given the raw material or the possibility, like a glimpse at correct ideas, then as we filter through wrong ones and right ones. And there's a way that we can tug it at a thread in a way that I'll show you even more how to do soon in webinars, that we don't need to be pulled along by our feelings necessarily, although I totally acknowledge that they exist. Okay. However, it isn't necessary and I can't prove it either way. And so that kind of thing, I don't assert, as nice as it might be, because I don't know. And I don't see how anyone can know it for sure, but maybe they can. But if they could, they'd have to show me or you. Right? You don't know something from a feeling. It becomes very helpful to have your feelings get integrated with what you otherwise know. But that's also in my future slides. Yeah, Shelley quoted Proverbs. Still, how accurate is everything Solomon said? It's hard to know for sure. Solomon was definitely limited in his understanding. There's no question about that. There may well have been a way that he was inspired and that God protected what was written in the Bible so that the raw meaning of the Proverbs that Solomon said are all have a trueness to them. But certainly Solomon was limited. I mean, he wrote Ecclesiastes. Everything is meaningless. And there's a limitation to that. Bill said, oh, you said about the glimpse that I mentioned that. Oh, and the glimpse is what led me to be mentioning the book Pictography. I do recommend reading it. It'd be interesting to discuss about it at some point. If enough people read it, maybe all of you will, then we can talk about it specifically. There used to be meetings where people would talk about the book and stuff like that. It's interesting fodder for discussing our concepts for sure. And lots of just great stuff in there. He's really very, very talented. And his insight was way beyond most people, as far as I can tell. Joseph says, can you explain when in your thought process you eyeball things and how that differs from when you use the four perspectives and extreme test? It's all one and the same and great questions. It's all part of eyeballing it. You're looking at things from different perspectives. You're eyeballing it. You do things to stretch to bring you more clarity, right? Here, another way to put it is you're always eyeballing things. You're always going to think and act based on the current level of clarity you have. And so you don't have to think about when should I eyeball it. You literally always are eyeballing things and you can't help it. Sometimes you have perfect clarity. In other words, like I said, you can see the two pictures are definitely different, and there's no question that they're different paintings, even though you might not know every pixel of the painting, right? So there you go. But you always operate on the current level of your distinctions and clarity. What you can do that's incorrect is have wrong ideas interfere with gaining clarity, which absolutely happens, right? The progress trap, the source trap are things that massively interfere, really fully interfere with gaining clarity. They project on top of clarity and occlude it, however you want to think of it. So the issue isn't whether or not you eyeball, the issue is whether or not you're dissolving things that are interfering with clarity, and or are you seeking clarity? But really seeking clarity ends up, I would say, you're always taking in inputs regardless of whether you're seeking clarity on purpose or not. The big thing is whether you're seeking to dissolve things that interfere with clarity. You're seeking to have more clarity about things that interfere with. If nothing interferes with, I was going to say, if nothing interferes with input, but that would also have to involve interfering on the end of the input, right? If what I'm saying is still true, but it's so easy for the source thing and everything come to twist what I'm saying. Like there's a truth to saying that if nothing interferes with an input, then it'll give you clarity. But drawing a black and white conclusion from an input is interference. Sorry. Yeah. Like drawing a conclusion past most of when people draw conclusions, it's imposing a conclusion. Like the whole thing about turning gray into black and white. Doing a conclusion properly through the proper use of like logic, we could say, to be simple. That's correct and that's accurate and nothing. If you do that correctly, then it's true to say there's nothing interfering with the input or with in that case, the conclusion being correct. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. That may muddy the waters for the moment. It might give you something for the moment. I'll leave it at that for now. But okay, according to you, that clears it up. So I'm glad to hear it. I did say some correct things in there. Just not sure in practice whether that was helpful or helpful for the moment. Ultimately, it'll be helpful. Dave said something Jesus said comes to mind. Who gave John the right to baptize? Was it God in heaven or merely some human being? Yeah, I'm trying to think. I'm not disagreeing. Obviously, Jesus said that. Certainly, it was Jesus said that in response to people trying to trap him. And I think they were asking if he was the Messiah at that point. And he said, I will, but or they might have been asking him for a miracle. I can't remember. But then he said, okay, but first ask me this. And of course, they couldn't because they would either piss off John's followers or they would have to admit that why didn't they believe that Jesus sent since John pointed the way to Jesus? But I'm not sure where you're getting at. Otherwise, who gave John? Okay, let's see here. And Shelley agrees. Yeah, yes, he wants us to seek how to know him. Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. We are all kings and priests. Yeah, excellent. Yeah, as long as we seek properly. Obviously, Jesus himself said, ask, seek, knock, the door shall be opened and so forth. So that was another big clue about seeking understanding and that it related to faith, that somehow they had to be logically related or one and the same in a certain sense, right? It was always about resolving contradictions, not being a hypocrite, faith. They were all the kind of one central concept that must then perhaps be the same concept. And it all helped me tremendously. Very possibly was the thing that worked for me. Jennifer says, these concepts have made my life, relationships, including with myself and business, so much better and more satisfying. Thank you for continuing to hone the method of communicating these things to us, David. You're so very welcome, Jennifer. Yeah, I better bring things to a close, but thank you so much. And I appreciate that. It was very nice what you said in the beginning of the thread where you were so excited, you're excited about. It was nice comments prior to the webinar where further, of course, helps and be encouraging as I work on this throughout the day. Brian says, David, God wanting us to know him led me to one of my first big questions as a child. If God is a just God and wants all people to know him and also scattered the people by location and language, then he must have made a common thread, not just the Bible. And there had to be some thread, somewhat metaphorically, but really how we use it. And we could pull on, like pulling on a thread on a spider to unravel it, or like a detective pulling on one kind of thread to unravel a mystery. I agree. Exactly. There had to be something in the world, not even in nature in a sense, but not even just in nature, but inherent to the experience of being anyone, inherent to just experiencing a conscious field or our mind or however people want to refer to it, that we could understand the nature of God, including to the extent that we needed to the full extent that we needed to understand the nature of God, again, to the fullest practical extent that we would need to. because not everyone would have access to Jesus is the reality, including people that lived before Jesus. Right. Great. Thanks, Mike, for the name. With psychopictography. Yeah, exactly. My copy is physical. I actually had a previous copy that kind of fell apart with the binding, and so I recently ordered that new one. Oh, wonderful. Faith says I've been reading Not a Chance, which is a book by R.C. Sproul, typing it here. And that's one of my initial things that made such a difference for me. It wasn't part of my 16-year-old experience. I came across R.C. Sproul's book when I was about 23 or 24, but it opened up a whole huge world for me. It was a transition between, up until that age, I'd been mainly focused on the evolution versus creation debate. And he's the book that opened me up to the whole idea of logic and contradictions and the importance of them and the law of non-contradiction. And it was a major turning point and launching point in my life and big milestone, a critical part in my discovery process for myself. Doesn't mean that it'll have exactly the same impact on you, but Faith is loving it. So great to know. And thanks for sharing that, Faith. The book is called Not a Chance, as she's. And it opened me up to logic in a way that I'd never heard before, even in college or whatever. But I didn't take philosophy courses in college. Michelle says, do you view God as the source? God created everything, continues to create everything in the sense of creating everyone's consciousness field. The reasons why God makes your consciousness field the way it is rather than some other way are not all choreographed individually by God. They flow from laws, right? The laws don't rule God. The laws of physics and such are regularities with which God operates. If there was no regularities, there'd be no free will, because with no regularities, there would be no connection between this moment and the next. You might already know all this from me saying it before, but just to quickly summarize, right? So there need to be regularities, such as the laws of physics and other types of regularities. Perhaps that again, if you look at the extreme, if there was no regularity whatsoever between one moment and the next, right? And the regularities would have to literally constrain God, right? If there weren't regularities that God allowed to constrain God, logically speaking, right? Inherently a regularity, in order for a regularity to exist, such as the laws of physics, it would constrain God to act to uphold that regularity. God couldn't violate without it no longer being a regularity, right? Or at least every time God violated it, it would make it not a regularity. To the extent that there's not regularity, we don't have free will, right? Because if there's no reason from one moment to the next, and reasons can only come from regularities mixed with our choices and such. And the way things started, right? You have starting configuration, our choices, and the regularities. I believe that's the full ingredient. So within that framework, yeah, God's the source. And as far as that's what it means. What I'm talking about when I talk about a source is we don't want a source for knowing, for understanding. Of course, God is the source for making it possible for us to understand in the first place. And God would be the source, in a sense, of all the correct ideas that come into our mind. But we still need to be seeking understanding in order to interact with the way things are. Right. And that's all a consequence of allowing for free will, which allows for abundance, right? It allows for a better ultimate situation than if we were just drugged, like a bliss with no free will. Would that only be the case where you could do such a thing because God is all knowing? God being all knowing means that God is never deceived. And God wouldn't deceive us like directly. The consequence of the way God had to make the world in order for us to have free will, in order to have abundance, would lead to inherent illusions existing, but none of those are insurmountable, right? They're all overcomable but God, because God's all knowing, God would never be deceived. So any choice that God made would be the correct choice. Which is interesting because if you figure out what the correct choice would be in certain cases, it would never be a mundane thing. It would mainly be like a meta kind of overall type of thing. But if you figure out what the correct choice would be, then you could know that God would have made that choice. But something like torturing people forever with no chance of getting out of that wouldn't lead to abundance. It wouldn't. I don't know that it would. I can't. As far as I can tell, it's just inherently contradictory. The nonsense. That's what. Therefore, I think that anyone that believes that would be misunderstanding. I don't know exactly what happens after death in particular, but there are certain things that it seems would have to be the case. Things would have to continue as far as I can tell, or else it wouldn't really, God created things for abundance, for seeking understanding to lead somewhere. And so there wouldn't be a point to having the imperfections and problems we have now unless things could continue so that we could win. And I'm always open to being corrected, but that's my understanding. And I'm pretty clear with it, as far as I can tell. I try to be sparing with what I assert, but with those, it seems like it has to be the case. Megan Lee says, thanks for the important clarification. Yes, that's what I meant. Each time any piece from a source is consulted, like sentences recorded about what Jesus are supported to say, for example, needs to be tested. Oh, you're talking about testing sources, right? Correct. Each and every time you test, and you're looking to keep gaining clarity. And then you say that's what's so exciting about LOI method. Yep. Excellent. Wonderful. Yeah. And you're really, things are clicking for you for sure, Megan, for what you wrote. Roberto said, it's been a few years since I first listened. I plan on going through that again as part of going through the basics of law of implication. Basics, again, is kind of the wrong word. But in this series, I'm going to be covering what in my opinion, are the really critical, important frames. And I absolutely think that understanding how to know that God exists is crucial. There's a number of conclusions you can draw from it that are very practical. It's just one of those things where it's obvious, right? That it has the potential for a lot of impact, and it gives you a real confidence in the ultimate win in life, right? Which is useful. Right? Confidence is very useful as long as it's based in the right basis. But yeah, there's a great, nice, practical amount of confidence that comes from knowing that God's not in control in the sense of choreographing everything, right? Because God would have to contradict free will for that, and we know God's not doing that. But other than that, things are designed for the ultimate win, right? Just as I understand how to design things for the ultimate win, right? The method of seeking clarity always leads to the win, right? Either everything comes to a halt or you win. When you're no to build on clarity until you win, then the win becomes inevitable, which leads to a different and totally secure sense of confidence. Plus, you're actually doing things right. So it is the correct method, which is more effective, the correct method. And plus, you have confidence in it, which is more effective as well. And it's all just a wonderful spiral. And you can always plan to win eventually. That's how it always works. Right. I remember the pretty funny thing when I said for a lot of people, plan A, like their only plan is for plan A to work. And if plan A doesn't work, then they're just frustrated. Or maybe they have a plan A and plan B, but then that's it. And for me, it's plan A works, or, it's plan A works and I gain clarity, or plan A doesn't work and I gain clarity. And ultimately plan A in a meta sense always works, because what is ultimately plan A is to gain clarity until I win. And everything leads to gaining of clarity, regardless of the temporary result or feedback. All thoughts and actions, if you're seeking it, leads clarity, right? If you're seeking it by which leads to the dissolving of things that interfere with clarity. Like first you'll gain clarity. If you're seeking clarity, then you'll realize to seek clarity about clarity, which leads to clarity about things that interfere with clarity. And as you gain clarity about what interferes with clarity, then everything naturally leads to more clarity. Or we could say that all thoughts and actions lead to clarity, except for how that process interfered with unnaturally. And as you dissolve the unnatural interference, then naturally everything you do and think and try and actions that you take will do their natural thing, which leads to clarity. Regarding your true self, as is referred to by Vernon Howard, instead of looking at it as already existing in actuality, and you just need to get rid of the rags that cover it, I don't look at it that way. I look at it as, in a certain theoretical sense, your true self exists in the same sense as the example with math, right? The knowledge that 32 plus 32 equals 64, or I could pick one where you couldn't possibly have already memorized it if you just pick two 5-digit numbers and multiply. I'm not going to do an actual example, but that knowledge would not have already been in your true self or your subconscious or your mind or whatever to be drawn out. It would have to be constructed, presumably. At least I think that's fairly inarguable, or at least if we eyeballed it, we would go with that one. Actually, there's even a way to prove that having to do with an infinite amount of information would have to already exist currently in your true self. For that to be the case, and there's no infinite amount of anything that can currently exist. So there's no true self that has all this knowledge that already. What can be constructed, though, is if you add 32 and 32, then that can now be entered in to at least your memory, right? But your self, your true self. And that's just a trivial example. But if you figure out things about one's personality that you want to have, right? If you figure out about property rights, then that gets integrated into your self. And so it becomes more true. And it's like you're chiseling away at a sculpture, we could say. Maybe the raw material exists. And then you're building, like my personality now. It's built from what was there originally, and it's sculpted, not perfectly, but certainly it's been improved through greater clarity. And so I'm not fake. I don't wear a false face. My natural personality, being myself right now, is better than how it was, but it's built on my original self, but it's built and bridged through greater clarity. And now my self is what it is to the extent that it's sculpted. And then that can get improved upon until the win where I've sculpted out, I've cleared out bad ideas. And then either there's more good ideas to discover or they can all be discovered. And then we just have more good experiences, whatever. But anyway, that gives you a sense where your true self can be built. It can be built on where you are, including that have to involve some carving out of, or dissolving, right? But through a process of dissolving, it's like the idea of a sculpture where you imagine it's already there in the rock and you carve it out. You're starting with something and you build on it. And part of it is naturally there. And it might still affect your preferences long term on what foods you like or things you prefer and so forth. So that helps give a sense of a more accurate view or a useful mental picture of a true self. I can probably improve that even further in terms of making it more clear, but that's a good starting point. Yeah, we had a massive meeting over the minds over abundance early on. Great. Okay, wonderful. Oh, and you wrote some more stuff. My brain's about fried, so I'll take a look at that, and then we can continue in the discussion and obviously monologue and discussion and slides and everything next week. Thank you guys so much. Wonderful attendance and wonderful participation again. I appreciate it very much. And I'm very happy with how all this turned out this week, and we'll continue. Have a great week, guys. I believe I'll do this next week, play a little bit by ear each week in terms of this. Probably just keep it the same day and same schedule, but I'll obviously continue in general. You're welcome, guys. Welcome. Very well. Thanks, guys. Excellent. I'll end the webinar here, but your comments are always appreciated. And I will talk to you all next week. Bye, Jen.